to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and thank you so much for joining us for today's show. In April of 1878, everyone in and around Boston was talking about the haunted house on Kirkland Street. The story made the front page of the Boston Globe for several days in a row, as well as being carried by other major newspapers across the continent. The coverage drew thousands of spectators to come and see the mysterious home for themselves. They wanted to catch a glimpse of the frightening and unusual activity that had been plaguing the Marsh family, and perhaps, more importantly, they wanted to know if there was indeed a body buried in the basement. But before we get to that, next Thursday, December the 5th, is one of our favorite days of the year, and that's because it is Krampusnacht. Now, if you're familiar with Krampus, he is an anthropomorphic, half-goat, half-demon with horns who punishes children who have been bad throughout the year. He's kind of like an anti-Santa Claus. So the Feast of St. Nicholas typically takes place in Europe on December 6th, the following day. So on the night before, December 5th, Krampus night or Krampusnacht, this wicked hairy devil appears on the streets, sometimes accompanied by St. Nicholas, sometimes on his own, and of course Krampus visits homes and businesses, and this is a tradition that is still carried on in Europe. Now we have brought that tradition here to Canada, and every December 5th in Ottawa, at our ticket booth on Spark Street, you will have the opportunity to do a meet and greet and get your photo taken with Krampus himself, the evil Christmas demon. Krampus is going to be there from 5 to 5:30, and then from 7:30 to 8 p.m. As on 8 p.m. that evening, we launch our Nightmare Before or After Xmas tours, where we talk about some of the creepy Christmas traditions from around the world, like Krampus, and of course, also share some of our favorite Christmas-themed ghost stories. So, Thursday, December 5th, if you're in or around Ottawa, come visit us on Spark Street and get an awesome Christmas keepsake of you, your friends, and Krampus. Information about our Nightmare Before or After Xmas tours, which take place in Ottawa and Toronto, can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you can get 15% off all your tickets by using the code Haunted Talks, that's all one word, Haunted Talks, at checkout. Also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. And of course, be sure to subscribe to the show so you know when the new episodes are coming out. And we always appreciate a 5-star review from you on whichever platform you listen to us. Home to Harvard University, Cambridge is one of the best-known suburbs of Boston. In Cambridge, you can find 21 Kirkland Street. Today, on that property is the Treadwell Sparks House, which is owned by Harvard and is used as a residence for the holder of a prestigious professorship. However, it was not the original structure that stood on that property. In the 1850s, a more modest 2-story single-family home stood there. As early as the 1860s, stories began to circulate about the strange nocturnal disturbances in the building which could not be traced to any cause. Several families moved in and out of the residence without explanation, often only after staying for very short periods of time. It became known in the neighborhood as a haunted house, and locals would often walk by with bated breath and with quickened footsteps. In 1875, the home became tenantless, and Harvard students took the opportunity to often sneak into the spooky building late at night. They painted skulls and skeletons on the wall, which must have made for a very disturbing place to visit after dark. One student described an encounter he had in the building. It was like countless wings rushed by, and small, low voices whispering, as if a crowd was all around us. Suddenly, I felt suffocated. The air was so heavy I could not breathe, and my vision was so obscured that I could not see my companion, who was right beside me. I felt like I was being pressed on all sides. His companion reported how a young girl briefly appeared to him, looking sad and dejected. He tried to speak to her, but she waved him away and then disappeared. The two men decided to leave the premises immediately. They were convinced that any person who spent a night in that home would come to the conclusion that the house was haunted. In 1877, an English gentleman by the name of Henry Marsh, in search for a house, came upon the residence, and for whatever reason, thought it would be the perfect spot for his family. As the building was in very ill repair, he worked out a special deal with the landlord. If the landlord was to cover the costs of all the supplies, he would repair the house and then receive a rent of $15 a month, about half of what similar dwellings in the area were going for at the time. Before he could move in, well-meaning neighbors did inform him of the haunted house's reputation. Marsh pooh-poohed the matter while gently patting his revolver. He also randomly met a medium while in a cobbler's shop who told him, "You are going to move into a haunted house where the spirits will manifest themselves. They will create some disturbances, but it will not trouble you one bit." Unswayed, Marsh then energetically set to the work and shortly thereafter moved in with his wife and his children. While everything seemed to be going well, he did keep watch every night for about 3 weeks with his trusty 7-shooter for the appearance of ghosts. None came, and he was convinced that this house would be a great home for his family. For 3 months, all was calm. Until the lady of the house, Mrs. Margaret Marsh, who was a midwife and often had patients in the house, began to become disturbed by some unexplained noises. While in the front bedroom on the second floor, one of her patients suddenly pulled the covers up over her head and whispered, "Someone is coming." Footsteps were heard crossing the adjoining room. Thinking it must be her husband, she was not too concerned. However, when no one emerged, she went to check and found the room empty. Then, proceeding to check upon her husband and children, she found them all fast asleep. A few nights later, a patient suddenly reported that a carriage had stopped just outside the home. Mrs. Marsh went to the window, saw nothing, but distinctly heard the crack of a whip and the thud of horse hooves and the sound of carriage wheels rolling. The activity seemed to be accelerating. The family would hear the sound of a struggle taking place on the second floor while they were all on the first, which would culminate with the sounds of a body hitting the floor and then rolling down the stairs. One evening, a tremendous crash was heard coming from the dining room closet, as if all the shelves had collapsed. Mr. Marsh rushed over and found everything exactly as it had been left. Not a cup or plate out of place. The live-in maid was also experiencing unusual activity. The furniture in her room was being moved by invisible hands. She would hear the terrible shrieks of an unseen woman, and windows would open and close all on their own. Another young lady who was visiting the house suddenly let out an intense scream and explained it felt as if two clammy hands were compressing the sides of her head. Given the reputation of the building, the family was getting quite frightened and began to think about moving out. But the location and the rent were incredibly hard to beat. Friends with an interest in spiritualism suggested the family try to contact the spirits for themselves, and the group decided to hold a seance without a professional medium to see if anything would happen. The family wanted the manifestations to stop and would seek out the clergy next if spiritualism failed to stop them. No sooner had the group joined into a circle when Mrs. Marsh became entranced, and to the astonishment of all present, became controlled by the spirit that haunts the house. The spirit described a young woman brought from a home in the country to Boston and ultimately to the house at 21 Kirkland, where she was carried up the stairs, murdered, and then buried in the cellar. Her name was Bertha Stoughton, and her remains were buried against the north wall, about 4 feet underground. Once out of the trance, Mrs. Marsh could scarcely believe the message that had been conveyed through her. Over the next few days, several more seances were held, some with professional mediums, others without. One of the mediums indicated the murderer was a man by the name of Herbert, and he would soon turn himself in to the police. Another medium was led down to the cellar. When not 2 steps down, she began to cry in an agonized voice, "Not there, not there, don't take me there, I don't want to go down there." She was eventually persuaded to continue down and remarked, "It was not here, but there," pointing to a smaller cellar under the kitchen, which was only about 7 feet by 10 feet and only 3 feet high. And that was the place where Bertha was buried. The Marsh family were convinced and decided they would start digging in that cellar in the coming days. Now, much of the preceding information I have just shared was published on Saturday, April 6th and Sunday, April 7th, 1878, on the front page of the Boston Globe, among other papers. These reports captured the public interest and created what we might call a media storm today, with reporters and several thousands of people stopping by the house to get a look for themselves. I admire the way a reporter from the Globe described it, saying, "Thousands of persons visited the area, including many churchgoers who happened to choose a route that would take them by the haunted house on their way home." As rumors began to circulate through the crowd that Mr. Marsh was about to start digging at any moment, the police had to be called in to maintain order. The drawn curtains of the house only seemed to increase the speculation and the desire for answers. At the same time, reporters began to search out previous owners of the residence to see if they too had experienced unusual activity. A servant who had lived in the building several years earlier, confirmed that she also heard strange noises and wouldn't live in the home again for $1,000, which would be about the equivalent of $50,000 today. The last family to live in the home before the Marshes never heard any strange noises, nothing supernatural or frightening. They did say the house was full of rats, which may explain some of the reports. They did believe that Mr. Marsh would find bones because they had buried animal bones in the cellar. As for the ghostly carriage that was heard outside the home, they suggested the sewer that runs beneath the street can cause a loud echo, and that maybe they were hearing a carriage much further down the way. Lastly, the family indicated they had not moved out of 21 Kirkland because of some supernatural or terrifying encounter, but rather because the landlord was not keeping the place in good repair. So, they left. It was around this time that the public perception of the story began to change. The wonder and excitement of a haunted house was replaced by a skepticism and a sense that it may all be a hoax. Visitors began to catcall Mr. Marsh and his family, with one group of men yelling, "Mr. Marsh, why haven't you started digging yet?" And then responded to their own question with, "We know. You need time to bury some bones." The Globe also reported 2 incidents that cast Mr. and Mrs. Marsh in a bit of a harsh light. On the Globe's first visit to the home, Mrs. Marsh offhandedly remarked that if the matter got into the papers, public attention would be attracted to her home. And she was right. And that, in such an event, would it not be quite proper to hold circles or seances and make the occasional prophet herself? Mr. Marsh was reported saying, "Looky here, there is money in this thing. I was offered quite a sum today for the information you are seeking for, and I mean to hold my tongue till I see how it goes." As the Globe commented, this does not, of course, invalidate the more sensational statements made by Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, but it does establish a motive and a ground for belief that the developments and manifestations will be likely to continue for some time. The next day, April 9th, the Globe reported that in spite of all the excitement, there was a growing feeling that the investigations will fail to find anything positive that indicates a blood-curdling tragedy has ever been committed and concealed at 21 Kirkland. No one who has turned up remembers a Bertha Stoughton, and the all-night digging done by professional gravediggers has failed to turn up anything other than some small animal bones, which was predicted the day before. Nor has the alleged murderer, Herbert, come forward and turned himself in. Though another seance held in the house claimed that the murderer was named William, not Herbert, which means the spirit was confused not only about who murdered her, but where her remains were buried. Or, of course, the third option, which is some or all of the mediums were charlatans. In the final seance that is recorded at the home, which occurred on April 9th, the medium performed several incantations and claimed to have freed Bertha's trapped spirit, and she expected no more disruptions for the family. Trying to track the story forward from here becomes a little difficult, and I would say generally it seems like there was no further activity. In fact, I only found 2 more references to the story at all. The first was a letter written to the editor of the Globe by a Harvard student and was published mid-April. It reads, I have been interested, as has every intelligent person, in the Globe's full reports of strange events at the haunted house in Cambridge. Before I go any further, however, let me say that I am not a spiritualist, and until last night have ridiculed the idea of the existence of ghosts. At that time, however, I had an experience which has caused me to think more carefully about the subject, and of which I thought the public ought to hear, insomuch as it bears directly upon the subject of the murder of Bertha Stoughton. Last evening, near the hour of midnight, I was led by circumstances to go down to Kirkland Street, directly past the famous house. I had thought nothing about the house, however, until just before I reached Baldwin Street. There, I met two blue-coated guardians of the peace, and as I passed, I heard one say to the other, "If you had seen and heard what I have, you would not say that." This led me to notice the house somewhat curiously. The dim moon was just entering the shadows of a cloud. In the distance, the bells were clanging out the hour of 12. The street was deserted. Even the measured tramp of the patrolman had ceased to be heard in the distance. All was silent as death about the house, and in the gloomy shadows of the pines which stand around it. Suddenly, just as I came opposite the dwelling, I heard a cry. So shrill, so startling, so unlike anything natural, that I involuntarily halted and strained my eyes in the dark to see whence it came. All at once, more still, and had it not been for the awful tones still ringing in my ears, I could have believed that I have dreamed. But again, suddenly, as I was about to go on, that terrifying shriek rang out, like an agonized screams of a dying woman, directly from the house. No living thing could be seen. The sound seemed to spring from the air. Great beads of perspiration stood upon my brow, and I have the reputation of not being someone easily frightened. Thoughts of poor murdered Bertha Stoughton chased each other madly through my brain. Surely this could be none other than her restless spirit calling out for vengeance. But it was not. It was cats. In a similar vein that shows how the public perception of the Marshes has shifted, the final report connected to the haunting concerns a lecture that Mr. Marsh was going to give on the campus of Harvard about his experiences in the home. Now, this was about late April, so only 3 weeks or so since the story first broke, and thousands of people had descended upon his home. That night, though, after only 25 people showed up for his talk, he decided to cancel the lecture and refund the 25-cent admission fee that had been charged. Sometime between the end of April 1878 and June 1880, the family moved out of the Kirkland home and relocated into Boston proper. Mr. Marsh passed away in 1906, and Margaret in 1920. What happened to the house is a bit of a mystery. We know that by 1960, the building was no longer there, as the current building on the property, the Treadwell Sparks house, was moved there from just around the corner, so it couldn't have been there then. But I can't say for certain what happened to the original home at 21 Kirkland. In working on this story, I did manage to contact a family friend of a direct descendant of Mr. and Mrs. Marsh. But as of this time, I have not heard back from them as to their take on the story, or if any of the details involved may have made its way through family history, we can figure out a little more about what happens next. Of course, if I hear from them, I will fill you in. For now, though, we're left with a conflicted tale. There is clearly some motive and realization by the Marshes that having a notorious haunted home could be profitable. But at the same time, the majority of the witnesses the reporters interviewed in the neighborhood all seem to agree the family were a very upstanding, respectful, and serious bunch. If any of our listeners are Harvard students or happen to live in that area, or more particularly, if you happen to have been in the Treadwell Sparks house, I would be very curious to hear if you've had any unusual encounters there. As far as I can tell, up to this point, none have been publicly reported. Thank you so much for joining us for the episode. A reminder, our Nightmare Before and After Xmas tours are now on sale, and if you want your photo taken with Krampus, Santa's evil twin, be sure to join us in Ottawa on Thursday, December 5th to get your photo with Krampus. The information about all of our tours, including the meet and greet, is on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you can get 15% off all your tickets by using the code Haunted Talks, that's all one word, Haunted Talks, at checkout. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to us, and a 5-star review is always greatly, greatly appreciated. As always, thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.